endlessly searching for an original sin.
So if anyone's wondering why this week you only got Sweet Pool, basically, one Amity Park, and a lot of Four Elements Trainer, I've broken Something Unlimited, and I've broken Divine Adventure. I'm impressed with even myself on this one. I don't know how I do the things I do, but I do them. So, yeah, I don't know what to do. I've reached out to both developers. Both teams are very nice, so I should hear from them soon. But yeah, and happy first of the month. I'm going to be at a hotel most of this week. And my Digimon game didn't arrive in time, so I'm sad. But let's continue. I want to play Digimon, but I can't play Digimon because Digimon didn't arrive. That day, the sunset was more vibrant than ever. For some reason, the color reminded him of old dried blood. After gazing at the sky through the windshield a little while longer, Kitani got out of his car to wait for Zenya as always. Just as he finished his first cigarette, he spotted the boy passing through the gates. Kitani quickly crushed his cigarette in his portable ashtray and opened the rear passenger door. That was very loud for me.
Tadaima.
Zenya sounded unusually chipper as he climbed into the back seat. He'd been in a bit of a gloomy spell recently, but perhaps something had cheered him up at school. As Kitani started the car, he heard Zenya humming behind him. Steering the car onto the street, Kitani kept his eyes on the road as he asked.
Hmm?
In the rearview mirror, Zenya was smiling to himself as he gazed out the window.
いいことね。あった。かな。何をですか？もうすぐってこと。感じたんだよね。体で。
Zenya never made much sense to begin with, but combined with his cheery mood, the statement gave Kitani pause. His eyes darted to Zenya's reflection in the mirror, then back to the road once more. With each passing second, the Okinagas, Zenya, and Konehito both were changing. He thought back to the phone call from the man named Kamiya, and how upset Konehito had been. Today was the day Kitani planned to investigate the chapel. He'd been hoping to avoid this if possible, but he was at the end of his rope. He needed to pull the trigger before it was too late. Furthermore, truth be told, it hurt to be kept in the dark like this, after all that he had given to the family. Perhaps it was only natural considering his position. Still, he wasn't the type to sit back and watch. If his actions angered Konehito, he would accept his punishment with grace. Zenya was still humming. Glaring up at the fading sunset, Kitani tightened his grip on the wheel. Once they arrived at home, Kitani was about to start dinner preparations when he heard the phone ringing in the dining room. The chime echoed in his ear and he stood there, rooted in the vague sense of unease. He reached out and lifted the receiver.
はい。もしもし、神谷です。国人さんいらっしゃいますか？
Kamiya. Alarm bells went off in his brain. Should he go straight to Konehito? Or was this an opportunity to do a bit of digging? As he weighed the options, he heard footsteps thundering down the staircase. A moment later, the door to the dining room burst open.
誰からだ？親父。
Konehito stood there, gasping for breath, his face ghostly pale.
誰からだ？また、神谷という方から。勝つ
Visibly terrified, Konahito snatched up the phone out of Kitani's hand and put it to his ear.
もしもし。はい。はい、そうです。
Kitani stood beside him, intent on scrutinizing Konahito's every last blink, but quickly discovered that he didn't need to. In a matter of moments, all the blood had drained from Konahito's face.
まさか、それでは。はい、はい、しかし。はい、わかりました。
White as a sheet, Konohito returned the receiver to its cradle. Afterwards, he stood there, staring off into space. Really quick, people have asked if this is going to go for past members on YouTube. Yes, actually, when I finish this series, I'll release it after... maybe the quarry? Depends on when I finish it. I want to have this series fully finished. The room was not particularly warm, and yet his forehead and neck were dripping with sweat. Kitani was about to say something when the door opened and Zenya poked his head in. Konahito marched over and seized him by the collar.
親父、この大バカ者が。
Konahito moved surprisingly fast. Even Konahito couldn't stop him in time.
落ち着いてください。
Konahito rushed over and looped his arm around the man's shoulder, pinning his arms.
離せ、ゼイヤ、この大バカ者が。
Konahito growled, flailing in Kitani's grasp. In the struggle, Zenya fell back onto the floor and glared up at Konahito from under his disheveled hair.
なぜ私の言うことが聞けんのだ。お前は、御主様から尊き血肉を分け与えられた身だというのに、この愚か者。
知るか。俺は出来損ないなんだろうが。尊き血肉。ふざけんな。誰もそんなもん欲しくなかったんだよ。
罰当たりが。やめてください、親父。
Konahito screamed and swung his fist. Kitani tried to restrain him but was flung off.
この。
Kitani swung down at Zenya's head. A dull thud echoed through the room. Zenya curled up on the floor, shielding his head with his arm, and Konahito raised his fist again.
ダメです。やめてください。
Stop beating Zenya, even if he deserves it.
うるさい。離せ。
Kitani latched onto Konahito's raised arm, and then the old man rounded on him. His expression was almost demonic, with wide eyes and deep crest wrinkles. A radical change from the simpering coward who prostrated himself on the floor of the chapel.
離せ、北に。落ち着いてください。
After a brief struggle, Konahito finally relented. Breathing heavily, he flung his arms into the air.
こうしてはおれん。やはりお告げの通りに、御主様を復活させる儀式の準備をしなくては、一刻も早く。
So, even if you don't like, that this is a yaoi and all that stuff, you have to give it to them for the art and the looks. Like, look, they could have just used some other thing, but they are making several different poses for different things. Like, look at Kitani or Konahito. He's insane right now. Just nuts. Bellowing nonsense at the top of his lungs, Konahito dashed out of the room. His footsteps faded. Kitani surmised he was headed for the chapel. He turned to Zenya. By the way, people have asked when I'm finishing the letter. That's our October game. And I do plan on also going back to Corpse Party. Maybe after Somnum 2. Excuse me. The boy was sitting slumped on the floor, his head hung low.
坊ちゃん、大丈夫ですか？
Poor Zenya. Kitani extended a hand to help him, but Zenya was swatted away, then staggered to his feet. Beneath his long blonde locks, his complexion was startlingly pale. Without so much as a glance at Kitani's direction, Zenya silently left the dining room. He walked down the hall, up the stairs, into his bedroom, and locked the door behind him. After a few minutes, Kitani followed him and put his ear to the door. He could hear something rattling inside, Zenya's dice. With a heavy heart, Kitani returned to the first floor. Back in the dining room, he pulled out a chair and collapsed into it. Then he leaned his elbows on the table, laced his fingers, and buried his face in his hand. He was utterly exhausted. That call from Kamiya must have been serious, considering how enraged Konehito had been. What could Kamiya have said? Kitani took a deep breath, then set his transceiver to replay the call it had just recorded.
国人さん、あなたにはほとほと失望させられました。私は確かに警告しました。なのに、息子さん一人の手綱もろくに握れないとは。状況はますます予断を許さない局面に至っています。これ以上余計なトラブルを抱え込むわけにはいかない。残念ながら、もうあなたに教団の要職を務めさせるわけにはいきません。沖永家の御主様はこちらで回収させていただきます。後日そちらへ伺いますので、そのつもりで。
Who was this benefactor? Moments ago, Konehito had described Zenya as anointed with the holy flesh of the benefactor. In response, Zenya had called himself defective. I never asked for this, he said. Defective. He'd said the same thing that night Kitani had found him rolling his dice on the dining room floor. At the time, he assumed there was no deeper significance to the word, but perhaps he had been mistaken. And then there was this ritual Konehito had been screaming about. To the average person, they would sound like a deranged rambling of a madman. Konehito, or Kitani, would have seen it that way himself, if not for Kamiya. But the involvement of a third party made it much more likely that something really was going on. Zenya might be involved as well. He needed to know. Something told him that soon it would be too late. Kitani quietly closed his eyes, but the fear gripping his heart would not go away. Konehito didn't leave the chapel until the small hours of the morning. His face haggard, he went straight up to his room. As Kitani watched through the crack of the door, Konehito quickly fell fast asleep. He was snoring so loud nothing was liable to wake him now. Stealing his resolve, Kitani descended the stairs into the basement. Soon he was standing in front of the grimy wooden door. The door to the chapel was thin and cracked, and Konehito always kept it locked. Kitani's heart ached with guilt, but it was too late to turn back. Licking his chapped lips, Kitani extended a sweaty hand and grasped the doorknob. He needed to do this as quietly as possible. Stooping down, he drew his right leg back and then kicked forward as hard as he could. Something gave way. With a clunk, the door came loose. Gave it a little push, and it opened with no further trouble. The chapel was dark and noticeably chilly. He could barely make out the interior. He didn't believe in gods or ghosts, but he still found the place unsettling. Scanning the room, his eyes settled on an altar where Konehito would always pray. Something was resting atop it, concealed behind a curtain. At the base of the altar was a chest of documents. Kitani walked up to the chest, crouched down, and pulled it out. It was small enough to fit in his arm and engraved with a strange pattern of entwining snakes. Using both hands, he carefully lifted the lid. Sure enough, the chest was full of books and papers. He grabbed a few random and flipped through them. Some of the pages were browning on the corners, while others had been torn and taped back together. They were clearly very old. The tone of the writing was quite formal as well. Were these research papers? As he worked his way through the contents of the chest, he found a small leather-bound notebook laying at the bottom. The book had been well worn from years of use and smelled faintly of stale oil. Inside, every page was covered to the margin with scribbled writing. It seemed that the previous owner had been an obsessive source. As Katani flipped through it, he found a small card sandwiched between the pages. At first glance, it looked like a driver's license. Further inspection, however, revealed it to be a registration card of some kind. One look at the name, and Katani's eyes went wide. If his memory was correct, that was Kanehito's uncle's name. Why would Kanehito's uncle's notebook be here? With an encroaching sense of dread, Katani returned his attention to the pages. Our sect, the Liberated, has hidden them, protected them, and worshipped them for many years. There is no greater honor than to share our lives with them, but this blessing is not granted to just anyone. I am one of the lucky few. I hope that this record will be passed down through the ages, so that all my descendants may know this joy. They live in symbiosis inside our bodies. I call them, henceforth, inner beings. Exactly how many followers did the Liberated have? He had to know more. His eyes devoured the notebook's contents, and there he found described a word more bizarre than anything he might have hoped to imagine. If everything in here were true, but no, it couldn't be. The only logical conclusion was that Kanehito's uncle had lost his mind. Except, there was one thing that this explained perfectly. Zenya. Something heavy struck the back of his head. Before he could do more than realize that someone had attacked him, his sight dimmed and he slipped into darkness. Today was Kamina Academy's founding day. Thankfully, that meant no more classes. Upon arriving home the night before, Yuji had fed his fish, crawled into bed, and passed out until morning. He must have been more tired than he realized. He woke up feeling completely drained and lay curled up in bed for quite some time. But though his body was fatigued, his spirit was strangely light. The sun filtered in through the gaps in the curtain, illuminating the room ever so slightly. Yuji stared up at the ceiling and exhaled slowly. Yesterday, after leaving Tetsuo's house, he practically skipped all the way home. It still didn't feel real. If someone were to tell him he'd dreamed the whole thing, even the part where they'd cleaned up the lump he'd birthed in Tetsuo's room together. He was grateful that there was no school today. Not only was he aching all over, but he had no idea how to face Tetsuo after that. He glanced at the window beyond the gaps in the curtain. The sky was blue and cloudless. He guessed it was around noon. He couldn't remember the last time he'd enjoyed such a peaceful weekend. Before now, he'd always have to wrestle with some lingering anxiety. Today, however, was different. Today, he could truly relax. He lay sprawled out ungracefully on the bed. Drowsiness soon reared its head once more. But just as eyelids began to droop, his phone started to vibrate on the coffee table. Jostled back to reality, Yuji gingerly sat up, reached for his phone. There was a message from an unfamiliar address. Was it from someone at the academy? Though suspicious, he opened the email. I'll tell you everything. Come to school ASAP. That was all. One possibility came to mind. Could the message come from Zenya? Yuji had never told Zenya his email address, but well, this was Zenya he was dealing with. He could easily have dug it up somewhere. Besides, he couldn't think of anyone who would have sent him something like this. Everything about it reeked of a trap. And considering the most likely culprit taking the bait almost certainly meant risking his life, no exaggeration. The question was, should he risk it anyway? Staring down at the screen, he weighed his options. Had he already decided to accept his new life? What more did he really need to know? Tetsuo's face flashed through his mind. He had no obligation to go. But no matter how many times he tried to shrug it off, his heart still wavered. He wanted to know the truth. Phone still in hand, Yuji got out of bed and quietly closed his eyes. He wanted to know the truth about himself, no matter what. Opening his eyes once more, Yuji closed his email. And that's where we're going to leave it, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining me. You guys are awesome, and hopefully we'll be able to return to the other games soon. And I hope you guys have been enjoying Sweet Pool. Who do you guys think was on the phone or in the email? Let me know in the comment section. Bye, everybody.